I often talk about bad reporting in the media, fake news if you will. Unfortunately, it's not too hard to find these days. You know what I'm talking about, misrepresentations of facts, mischaracterizations of what someone did or said, often written by activists driven more by ideology than a commitment to uncovering objective truth. And it's even more interesting when you are the subject of misrepresentations, or in my case, being taken out of context to correspond with a predetermined narrative. Back in late September last year, I attended the annual Libertyfest conference in which I gave a speech titled The Whinging Gap. Prior to giving my speech, I was interviewed by a journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald together with Bettina Arndt. I then had several follow-up questions via email over several weeks from the journalist, Tim Elliott, to get my views on issues ranging from climate change to safe spaces. In the end, he used none of the responses given in the 1.5-hour face-to-face interview and none of the responses to any of the follow-up questions via email. The author simply took 5 quotes from my speech, most of them out of context, to present me as some kind of paranoid right-wing woman hater. Why didn't he use any of the other stuff? I assume because none of it was controversial. It didn't fit the narrative. I mean, how can you paint me as a bigot if you put down that I believe in man-made global warming, that I voted for gay marriage, and believe in equality of opportunity? Now, the quotes he did include, he ran past me before publishing, but he didn't include any of the context around those quotes that I included, both in the actual speech or in the email responses in which he sought clarification of my quotes. And you can see why he didn't just by the way he describes Libertyfest. While only in its second year, the festival has proved itself to be a steamy little greenhouse for the fruitier wing of conservative thought, a safe space for climate skeptics, alt-right firebrands, and people who regard Donald Trump as the greatest American president in the history of the universe. Past speakers include former One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts and current One Nation recruit and former federal ALP leader Mark Latham. So obviously, since my views don't conform to that generalisation, they aren't mentioned. So let's go through the 2 paragraphs Tim Elliott devoted to me. We also hear from Scott Crow, a Gold Coast-based YouTuber who spends 40 minutes pouring molten derision on what he calls the cult of female victimhood, suggesting there's a certain class of women, usually university educated from middle to upper class backgrounds, who prefer to blame the patriarchy rather than take responsibility for their own lives. Obviously, this has been paraphrased, but it is entirely accurate, although he omitted the humorous parts that got a good laugh in the room. There is video footage of my talk, but unfortunately it hasn't been released yet. But I do still have the text of the talk, which is almost word for word what I said. And here it is. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not talking about all women. I'm talking about a specific class of women, usually university educated, come from middle to upper class backgrounds, often work at the ABC or the Guardian, and this is the distinguishing feature, have an inability to take responsibility for their own lives and prefer to instead blame the all-powerful and, to most of us, invisible patriarchy. Crow's default setting is wounded contempt. Now, he's definitely right about the contempt. I am contemptuous of feminists crying victimhood every 5 minutes, although I don't know where he gets the wounded part from, as though I'm painting myself as a victim. In fact, I went on to say at the end of the speech that I don't believe the answer is to create a parallel victim industry for men, but rather to demand that women put on their big girl pants and woman up. He goes on, tennis champion Serena Williams is, he tells us, a child. Yes, he lifted a single word from the 4 paragraphs in which I talked about the Serena Williams meltdown at the US Open. Here's part of what I said. Take a more recent case. Serena Williams claims that part of the reason for her very public tantrum at the US Open is that she was fighting for women's rights. What right would that be? To carry on like a child because you're getting beaten. Strange that I've never heard Serena Williams fight for a woman's right to play 5 sets just like the men have to for the same prize money. Or was Serena Williams fighting for women's rights when she said to a female lineswoman who foot-faulted Williams at the US Open a decade earlier, and I quote, "I swear to God I'm going to fucking take this fucking ball and shove it down your fucking throat." Now, if that had been said by a man, he would be promoting violence against women. But when Serena does it, presumably she's fighting for women's rights, because gender equality or something. I won't bore you with reading the rest, but as you can see, I just go into the statistics that debunk her claim that men get away with misconduct more often than women do, which they don't. Elliott continues, And victims of sexual predator and film mogul Harvey Weinstein are cowards for not coming forward earlier. Now, that's not what I said or meant. I didn't use the word victims. He inferred it. Here's what I did say. And by the way, this is what's considered brave now if you're a woman. Yeah, I kept quiet as a young actress about the antics of Harvey Weinstein, but now that I'm an established actress that doesn't need to kowtow to Hollywood executives, I'm going to bravely speak out. No, that's called cowardice. Bravery is speaking out when you have something to lose. Now, I can understand someone thinking that this was about victims, but I was actually referring to those that knew about it but said nothing. I even clarified this in a follow-up email with the author. Here's what I wrote to him. You might want to reconsider this quote. Victims of sexual predator Harvey Weinstein are cowards for not coming forward earlier. The video of that talk is yet to be published, but it will be easy to verify what I actually said when it comes out. The references to those that stood by and said nothing even though they knew about the behaviour for decades, most prominently Meryl Streep. And I provided a link to a story showing exactly that. Oprah has also been accused of the same. Granted, from the text of my speech, I did not distinguish between victims and those that just knew of the behaviour and kept quiet, but the latter was the intended target. The comment is also couched in a wider context. Here is the paragraph. But of course, context doesn't matter. I agree that the Liberal Party has a woman problem, he tells the Room. The Liberal Party has a disproportionate number of whiny women. And yes, this quote is accurate, but it comes after what amounts to 3/4 of a page establishing the fact that certain Liberal Party women, most notably Julia Banks, are whingers, as Banks demonstrated with claims of women being singled out for bullying during the leadership stoush, for which not a shred of evidence has ever been offered. He then signs off by quoting from the movie As Good As It Gets, where Jack Nicholson's character and author explains his technique for writing convincing female characters. It's easy. I think of a man and I take away reason and accountability. A kicker that elicits much knowing laughter, including most bizarrely from the women in the room. Yes, you see, Tim has a problem with the idea that not all women think the same, and that some even have a sense of humour. But this is probably the most egregious of all by leaving out the context. Here's what I actually said. In the 1997 film As Good As It Gets, a starry-eyed young woman sidles up to the obsessive-compulsive and acclaimed author Melvin Udall, played by Jack Nicholson, and she asks, "How do you write women so well?" Nicholson takes one look at her and says, "I think of a man and I take away reason and accountability." Now, if that movie were made today, there would be a lot of confected outrage around such a sexist line. And it is sexist, apart from being funny. It makes generalizations about women that a generation of women have fought hard to dispel. But I submit to you, whether it's the hysterical behaviour of female activists on university campuses protesting Bettina Arndt, to the never-ending whinging about outcomes not being equal, today's feminist-driven gender equality movement is doing more to rehabilitate stereotypes of women as weak, pathetic whingers in need of constant scaffolding to navigate life than any movie line could possibly do. It's time to call out the whinging. And that's how I ended the talk. I acknowledge that it is a sexist generalisation, but that is what we see advocated for by feminists that push victim narratives. And again, I clarified this in an email exchange, but it doesn't fit the narrative. Now, I understand that this article is not about me. I'm a bit player at best, and the author can't include all the context around those quotes because it would take up half the article. But then why include them at all? Why not include one or two quotes with context, or a more well-rounded summary of the whole 40-minute talk, in which I make my case by providing anecdotes and empirical data from multiple sources about the extent to which women complain more whilst receiving equal and in some cases preferential treatment? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. It doesn't fit the narrative. The author Tim Elliott tried his best to elicit something bigoted during our interactions, but he couldn't, and so he resorted to quote mining. Tim was generally friendly in that disingenuous way journalists are when they are desperately trying to draw something from you that could be incriminating. Whenever we got deep into an issue, for example about the pay gap, he changed the subject because he realised the arguments made sense and there was no gotcha moment for his story. So let me try something here that demonstrates how important context really is. Tim Elliott could be described as a budget Guy Pearce. He comes off, not surprisingly for a Sydney Morning Herald journalist, as slightly effeminate. I wasn't quite sure of his sexuality, and I'm not even sure Tim is clear on that either. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Now, I could just leave that comment out there, but that would just be wild speculation on my part with no context. But since I do try to provide facts, evidence and context for the things I say, Tim is married, or so I gather from this fascinating piece on his daily practice of avoiding yoga, because this is precisely the kind of hard-hitting content that you would expect from a features and investigations journalist for the Sydney Morning Herald. And for more context, Tim started writing this piece back in the middle of October, as he informed me when he began asking follow-up questions via email. He was still asking questions in late November and sent me quotes for clarification in early December. And so if you want to know why mainstream journalism is dying, it's because, in part, they pay journalists like this to spend dozens of hours investigating only to turn out a caricature of someone's views that appeals to the confirmation bias of their audience. But as I said, this article is not about me. Much of it is devoted to Bettina Arndt and the protests she encountered at Sydney University when she went to speak about the fake rape crisis. But even here, the great investigator repeats claims by chief troublemaker Madeline Ward and lets them go unchallenged. Ward is quoted as claiming that she had bought tickets to the event, but that she couldn't go in because Bettina's people got rowdy and the police were called. An incredible claim if you watch the actual video footage, and which Bettina Arndt has subsequently published. Anyway, if you want to read the full article, I'll leave the link in the comments below. Oh, and you might want to read this article in The Guardian today about Vice laying off 250 staff. I just hope Tim Elliott doesn't join the ranks of his fellow journalists at the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, and now Vice, because he might just have to learn to code. I'll see you next time.